So in that first topic, we were looking at how we can set the service tier for our Azure SQL database. In the next topic, topic B, is all about determining an appropriate service tier. So how do we decide how many DTUs to give our databases? So in this topic, we'll teach you how to use the DTU calculator to make an estimate of the service tier you're going to need. And as you can see, you can change it at any time. Okay, and you can do that. You can monitor your Azure SQL database in Azure, look at the performance once it's up and running, and then make a further decision. But we've got this DTU calculator to give us an initial approach. Now, when it comes to determining an appropriate service tier, as a SQL DBA, if you're migrating to Azure and SQL Azure database, you're going to need to have an initial estimate as to the DTUs to assign to your database from the respective service tier. So an appropriate service tier will ensure you meet the performance goals of your application. Estimating a lower or higher tier will either result in bad performance or it will increase your costs respectively. Now there's a tool available to us called the Azure SQL Database Calculator. Now it was developed by Justin Henriksson, who's an Azure Solution Architect at Microsoft. And it can be used to find out the initial service tier for an Azure database. And you can see on the screen there we have a URL where you can go away and download or look at the DTU calculator. So let's have a look at the workflow for the database calculator. What do we need to do to use this calculator? We need to set up a trace on the database server, get the trace output in a CSV file, upload the result of the DTU on the DTU calculator website, and then we'll get an initial estimate of the DTUs we need for our workload. Now you can run the trace by either using the command line utility or the PowerShell script on the website. It captures the counters on a workload similar to that of a production environment. Trace generates a CSV report, and the DTU calculator then uses this report to make suggestions on your initial service tier. So, let's see how we go about it then. First, you have to set up a trace to record the following counters. Processor, percentage process time, logical disk reads per second, logical disk writes per second, and then database log bytes flushed per second. So in this lab, we're going to find an initial service tier for Azure SQL database using the DTU calculator. So when we come to do our migration, we might be unsure about the service tier that we need to select while migrating to Azure SQL database. We can utilize the DTU calculator to select the service tier to migrate to. So the aim here is to choose an initial service tier for a database that's going to be migrated using the DTA calculator. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to go along to the DTU calculator website, which is here, dtucalculator.azurewebsites.net, and we are going to download the command utility to capture the performance counters. Now, when we have the SQL Performance folder downloaded, there will be two files in it. There will be SQL DTU perfmon, which is an executable, and there will be SQL DTU perfmon.exe.config, which is a configuration file. It's the configuration file that specifies what to capture. So I'm going to edit this configuration file. Then I need to change some parameters in here. So first of all, I want to check that I am monitoring the default instance. Okay, so I need to change this to be SQL Server Databases for the default instance. And then in terms of the output file, okay, there's going to be a disk location of the output file section here. Disk location of the output file, I'm going to change this to C:\2, and I'm going to leave it exactly as is because that'll work for me. But if you wanted a different path, you could change this path here to specify a different path for the output file. So with the config file saved, we are now ready to capture the performance trace. Now to do this, I'm going to double click on the SQL DTU perfmon.exe file to run the performance trace, and a new command prompt will appear, as you can see here, and I'll just full screen that. And it's going to display the counters as they're being monitored and saved into the CSV file. So we've got a screen there, you can see as they're coming along, we've got CPU, disk read, disk write, and log bytes. Okay, so we can leave that run for a little while. And then when it's completed, the next step will be to upload the output of the results onto the DTU calculator website for it to analyse. And we'll just leave this run for just a second while that completes. When we've finished capturing our trace, the next step is to upload the output of the DTU outload. Once we finish capturing our trace, we then need to upload the file, the trace, to the DTU calculator website for it to analyse the results. So we can go to the website and then we're going to upload our CSV file and calculate. So we need to enter the number of cores. So on my server I've got 4 cores and I get to choose a file. Then I get to not the World Cup predictor. It's going to be on my C drive. It's going to be the output from earlier on. I'm going to go to code. I'm going to go to lesson 2. I'm going to go to DTU calculator and I'm going to choose my SQL performance log and I click on open. And then from there I will select the calculate button for the website to do its thing for me. Okay, now based on your database utilization, we recommend you migrate your SQL workload to a standard S6 service tier, and this should cover approximately 99.38% of your R utilization. There's 0.62% of your workload that falls into a higher service tier. After migrating your database, you should evaluate the performance using the guidance mentioned in the above section to make sure that we are hitting performance. So what the DTU calculator has done there, it has suggested that tier based on the trace file. It gives overall recommendations and further breaks down the recommendations by CPU, storage throughput and logs utilization. Now the DTU calculator suggests to migrate, in my case, to an standard S6 workload, as it covers the majority of the workload that has been captured in the trace. You can hover your mouse over these different areas here, check what percent of the workload each tier covers. You can see there that the majority of it is standard 6, some of it is basic, standard 0, standard S4, and so on. Now, the calculator has recommended a standard S6 tier based on CPU utilization. Okay, so if we expand out and view more details, we can see the breakdown by CPU and IOPS. So we can see that the standard S6 has been based on CPU usage. If we look at IOPS, we can see possibly the basic tier here would have been more relevant and the standard less so. So for the majority of our workload in IOPS, basic would have been fine. And remember, there's performance log levels as well. Just remember, this is just a suggestion, okay? It's just to give you a place to start from. You don't need to take these as is if you don't want to. You can make your own estimates, but you need to make sure you get the appropriate performance for your database. And at this point, based on what I've seen here with the performance for logs, service tier for logs, and IOPS, I would be tempted to start with basic and scale up if it wasn't meeting my demands.